From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
As the left becomes less religious, they become more statist. And as the right becomes more religious, they still become more statist.
Whenever you add government, you by default remove community.
Most of the blame goes on Obama, but it actually starts with Bush, right? Like in 2006.
Was he sitting very still, or did his phone go out?
And I have no intention of keeping any promise that I make.
It's bad that the state is as big as it is.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I am your host, Reed Coverdale, as always. And I've got a face that many of you probably know, at least if you're on Twitter. He's got a lot of great takes. Some I disagree with that we'll probably get into, but most that I definitely agree with. And I know he doesn't talk about this much, but I just found out he's only 23 years old. And that shocks me because of how successful he's been already. But Brad Polumbo, how we doing?
Hey, thanks for having me. And yeah, I guess we'll talk about it with your folks, but I generally don't stress the fact that I only graduated college a couple of years ago because I'm trying to do work by and large that's more advanced in my career.
Yeah, well, I just it just blew me away because of how intelligent and how well read and all the high profile places you've been. I just couldn't believe that. You certainly don't seem like you're only 23, so it's definitely a compliment from my end.
Yeah, I take it as a compliment, though. I think you saw this on Twitter where I mentioned I'm only 23. I found my first gray hair today, so that's kind of troubling. I think I've been spending too much time on Twitter.
Yeah, that'll give anybody gray hair, like even if you're just a teenager still. But it runs in my family. I don't have any gray hair yet, but my younger sister had gray hair when she was, I think, 14. So I don't know. It happens to everybody. But I've known about you for about a year. I found out about you through Twitter, and you're in a lot of the same circles of people that I'm a big fan of, specifically Rand Paul. I was a huge Rand Paul supporter in 2016. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you got into everything that you're involved with? What was the impetus behind that? And how long ago did you first start getting into it?
Yeah, so I would say my first, and this I think is true for a lot of young people, my first real political involvement was in 2016, the Trump-Hillary campaign. And I was a Gary guy. I was a sophomore in college at the time. And I didn't really have much love for either of the mainstream party's candidates. Very disaffected. I've technically been, I don't know what the difference is between, I don't pay dues. I'm not an LP member, but I've been a registered Libertarian Party voter my whole life. That's not something I talk about, actually, because I am viewed as more conservative. And I would put myself more on the libertarian conservative side, a la Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, than, the capital L libertarian side. But that is definitely where I started. And where I started was at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And for folks who don't know, UMass Amherst, I was an economics major. That's basically my main beat area that I write about a lot, is economics and public policy from a free marketeer perspective. And basically, UMass has the distinction of being the only Marxist economics department in the continental United States. So I went there. I had professors who were self-described feminist Marxists who wanted to seize the memes and the means. And it really honestly pushed me to the opposite extreme. So I became much more of a free market capitalist, was never a social conservative, hardcore, being gay, being from New England, from a more urban area. So my social views were always, I would never say socially liberal, because where I was from at UMass, socially liberal meant SJW. It meant anti-free speech, anti-due process. I guess I would say my social views are socially liberal in a classical sense. I'm a tad more culturally conservative. I'm a tad more maybe socially conservative, but really not very much. But in terms of government policy, I'm very laissez-faire in terms of social. If you're 18 and up, you should really do what you want in your own life. You're not hurting anybody else, is pretty much my guiding principle. But in terms of economics and public policy, I really was pushed away from the Marxist professors at UMass. And I started reading the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Reason. I got more involved. At first, I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer, and I did. And I did study to that end and enjoy it. But then I started at the college level writing for the campus newspaper, and I enjoyed it so much, being a shit stirrer at this left-wing campus and dropping, takes that we would think of as milquetoast, like we should have due process in campus proceedings. We should have concealed carry permits allowed on campus because all guns, including pepper spray, are banned from campus, even though they talk about how it has a rape culture, yet they don't allow women to even so much as carry pepper spray. So I wrote about that, and these takes in our crowds today would seem like pretty uncontroversial, right-of-center takes, but they thought I was the next Milo Yiannopoulos, basically, at UMass. So they really pushed back and were not fans of me, and I was not a popular figure, but I learned that I love, the battle of ideas, just debate, controversy. So I kind of dived into it head first and wound up getting into opinion journalism on a part-time basis, then full-time after graduation.
Yeah. Well, what was your first high profile appearance? What kind of, was it one specific appearance, or was it just a slow transformation, or did you have a star moment, or?
So the funny thing is, the first kind of national thing I did was, so I started out writing about my campus mostly, and then writing about Massachusetts. So the first big hit I got was in the Boston Globe, which for New Englanders, it's the biggest newspaper in New England. And I got that while I was still in college. I wrote an op-ed about how they were raising tuition prices at UMass. It was a public school. I've been to public school my whole life. But I wrote basically an op-ed saying, why don't they cut all the waste and administrative bloat instead of raising tuition prices again? And that went kind of within the UMass community, locally viral, and started my first big controversy. But then I ended up actually breaking into the national conversation over something pretty silly. But UMass was one of these extremely snowflakey campuses. When the day after Trump won, for example, most classes were canceled. There was a cry-in on campus. And then the classes that I did have in person, they went around and the professors didn't give a lecture. They just had everyone talk about their feelings and check in and make sure they felt safe. And so one of the ways this manifested itself, this kind of infantilizing, ridiculous culture on campus, was that they had, in my dorm when I was a junior, they put up Care Bears all around the dorm that reminded people to brush your teeth before you go to sleep. Make sure you're sleeping at least 6 hours a night. Drink 6 cups of water a day. Like the most absurd things to be advertising to 20-year-old adults on this campus. And I tweeted it, and I had started Twitter a little bit, it didn't have a big following or anything. And I took a picture of it. I was like, this is crazy. And then it went mega viral. And I actually got invited to go on Fox and Friends and talk about it. And that really wasn't where I started, but that was and I kind of kept doing things after that on many different subjects. But that was kind of the first big national hit I got. And looking back, it's kind of funny. But you got to take what you can get, anything to get a start.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like the last 4 years have been extremely controversial. Like if you have any opinions that are outside the mainstream narrative, maybe it's always been like that, but it seems like it's been driven to extremes the last few years. So you're definitely someone who has been espousing ideas that are outside the mainstream, but at the same time, you're an extremely reasonable person. If anybody listens to you, you're very nonpartisan. I mean, I've seen you on Twitter throughout the last year. When one side's doing something dumb, you always call them out, and then you do it to the other side too. So do you make a lot of people's heads explode because of that?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to build a big following is to just pick one narrative and stick to it. Pick Team Red or Team Blue and either become Brooklyn Dad on Twitter or become Charlie Kirk, right? And just put libs are dumb, RT if you agree, and get 500,000 likes or whatever. Or just chill for one side and constantly attack everyone. But I really honestly am not a partisan person. I've always been really interested in politics, but not party politics, not electoral politics. I never have wanted to work on an election or work for a politician, any of that. I've always been more interested in the policy side and the ideas side of things. So I have no loyalty. I mean, I definitely lean right, lean conservative, and I guess you could say I lean Republican in between the choice of Democrat or Republican, if you present that as a choice, with no other option. But I just have never had any, affinity or desire to be on Team Red, right? Like there are individual Republicans that I like. I really like Senator Rand Paul. I've gotten to know him a little bit, interviewed him a bunch of times. Tom Massey, Justin Amash was a Republican for a long time. I like some of the new Republicans in the House, like Nancy Mace in South Carolina, very libertarian leaning, promising young kind of rock star. But so I like individual Republicans sometimes, but I've never liked the Republican establishment that loves endless war and doesn't actually care about free markets or fiscal responsibility. And so I've never felt any sort of like a desire or need to defend these people. Like everyone, I'm always happy to say I wasn't a super anti-Trump person all the time, but like that's because I thought that was unproductive. I liked some of the stuff that he did in terms of the policy. I probably agreed with like 65 to 70% of Trump administration policy. But then 90% of the time that there was some controversy over something he personally said or did, I didn't feel the need to defend him if it was stupid or offensive or dumb. But at the same time, I never felt the need to show for the Democrats. I'm very anti-Democrat most of the time. I try to not just be reflexively partisan, but to me, there's not a lot of redeeming value on that side for sure. And then I never felt the need to like constantly obsess over hating Trump all the time and just oppose everything he did. Like I liked his deregulation. I supported the tax reform bill. I really love Neil Gorsuch and all those things. I'll give him a standing round of applause, right? But then at the same time, I have no problem saying, when he says very fine people or shithole countries or any of these things, I have no problem saying, or when he denied the election results, right? I'm not going to defend the indefensible because I'm not part of Team Red at the end of the day, and I don't have to drink the Kool-Aid even when it's laced with toxicity.
Yeah, it's been kind of funny to watch. People accuse you of Trump derangement syndrome if you would criticize Trump for anything, because obviously he was criticized for a ton of dumb stuff that that I didn't think held any merit. But that doesn't mean that he didn't do a lot of things that we don't like. And so then when I would go after him or when you would go after him, people would just be like, oh, you just hate him because he says mean words. It's like, well, no, I mean, some of what he's doing is actually really bad.
Yeah. The thing is that's hard too, is there actually are some people that do have Trump derangement syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like the Jennifer Rubins of the world, the people at the Bulwark. Like there are a few good ones, so let me have some exception, but the MSNBC and CNN conservatives, right, who all of a sudden are opposed to tax cuts and are just constantly criticizing everything Trump does, and it's kind of tiresome shtick. That at the same time, there were these people who were the always Trumpers, or they were so obsessed with being anti-never Trump that they were basically pro-Trump.
Right.
And it was never like that. I just honestly, when an event came up or a controversy or a statement or a policy, I would just look at it and say, what do I think of that? Good, bad, eh? And I just say that. And I would try to not let the past or obviously, I was never a fan of him. I never had a positive disposition towards Trump, but I tried to not let any negative disposition affect how I was evaluating a new rule, a new plan, or this controversy. I always just tried to look at what was in front of me and give my honest analysis on that. And I feel like that's what's really lacking, because objectivity does not exist. The idea that somebody can just be neutral, right? Even in news and journalism, my view is that you should put your cards on the table. I'm a libertarian conservative. I've got a right-wing perspective, but I'm fact-based, and I'll tell you what I think and be transparent about where I'm coming from. Right? What the problem is when you pretend to be neutral, and then even if you do try to be neutral, your subconscious biases will skew your coverage, and then what you choose to cover will have a selection bias. And so I think the answer to all of that is to just try to be fair, not unbiased. try to be transparent, not neutral. And that's just honestly what I've always tried to do. I've never been willing or interested in being a partisan, but I have my perspective, and that's what I can offer to people. And apparently, some people are interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And I have noticed that about you is that you don't stick to any party line. And it's so funny because a lot of libertarians act like they are neutral and they're not. I mean, they're just libertarian partisans. Like they can't, if somebody's a Republican who has a very libertarian idea, or if somebody's a Democrat who has a very libertarian idea, they're very hesitant to give them any credit, especially if it's someone like Thomas Massey, who does share a ton of crossover. And I know you also liked Tulsi Gabbard. I actually supported her in 2020, and that blew so many people's minds why I would like her. And to me, it was kind of obvious. There's a lot of crossover. And then beyond the crossover, she also wasn't a reptile like the rest of the Democrats who were running for president. But why did you like her? What was your reasoning?
So I wasn't a supporter because I don't support or oppose candidates. That's not what I do. I was definitely, a fan of her message in a lot of ways. The way that I always look, two things about Tulsi. One is just setting all politics aside, because I really do think, if you take the literal tankies and the alt-right out of it, people from different political backgrounds and partisanship and ideology can be good people or bad people. And their views don't really determine that. How they treat others is what determines that in my book. And so just setting aside the politics and the policy, Tulsi seems like somebody who is genuinely a good person, who cares about others. She doesn't demonize folks. She wants to talk to conservatives, Republicans, tell them why she does support some gun control, or she does support Medicare for all. Right. And she believes in, free speech and having conversations. And I never saw her as an angry tribalist. That's the thing. I wrote a piece for the Washington Examiner magazine about how you go back before the 2016 election, she was viewed as a rising star among the Democratic establishment. They loved her. Then when she endorsed Bernie over Hillary, they put her to the fringe. But she wasn't playing party politics. She wasn't towing to the line. And I only respect people who are independent thinkers. I don't respect people who are team red or team blue automatons. So the first thing I respected about Tulsi was that she seemed like a genuinely good person. And she also seemed like she was not a tribal robot, right? She was an independent thinker. The second thing was that I don't agree with her on even most things, but the things where I always say any issue area, show me the person that I can work with and I'll work with them, right? Whether it's on drug decriminalization, I will gladly, work with AOC and say, she's right. We need to legalize marijuana. I will gladly work with Ted Cruz on banning court packing, which I think is a very bad idea. And we should ban it under the Constitution, in my view. And he may have lots of things about him that make me really raise an eyebrow, but if he's willing to work with a specific issue, advancing liberty, advancing the values I believe in, power to you. And the thing about Tulsi is on foreign policy and on civil liberties, she is a rock star from the libertarian perspective. She's a combat vet who's been there, done it, seen it, and can speak about the cost of war in a really powerful and compelling way. And she made a tremendous case for bringing the troops home. And look, that's becoming something that even the establishment, like Joe Biden, has to at least say he's going to go do, right? Even I hope he does. I'm not sure he will, but he says he's going to bring the troops home from Afghanistan. Well, guess what? When Tulsi was saying that a few years ago, it was still radical. But people like her have moved the needle on those issues. And that's what she spends, honestly, 70% of her time talking about. So she may have lots of unlibertarian views, and that's okay. I don't dislike her for that. I just don't share them. But I'm saying she focuses so much on the things where I think she's just spot on. And the other side, too, is she's a really principled, old school ACLU style civil libertarian. So I always appreciated that she was pro free speech, pro due process, pro, protecting the liberties in terms of, I'm a big civil liberties guy, privacy. She even also criminal justice, right? When she called out Kamala on the debate stage and went viral, Chef's Kiss. I have watched that video literally 100 times. It will never get old. It will always be wonderful. It will always go down as probably the single most epic moment of the 2020 campaign. And she really, that kind of stuff. So that's the long-winded version of why I like her. But the short version is just she seems like a nice person. There's lots to work with her on, and she's not a tribal partisan automaton.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's rare. It's exceedingly rare to see that in anybody. And in some ways, I almost care more about that than what your views are. Like if you're a normal human who can talk to people who disagree with you and try to figure out a solution, you know, that's just disappearing. Like that's going away. It does seem in some cases that the Republicans have been more willing to talk about stuff they disagree with you on. They're less likely to instantly demonize you. They'll call you an idiot or a libtard or whatever if they disagree with you, where the opposing side, the Democrats, they call you evil if you disagree with them. You know, you're a Nazi or you're a racist or a white nationalist or whatever. So have you gotten a lot more hate from the left than you have from the right? Because I mean, you're also gay. I know that the Republicans are starting to not care about that as much, but I was wondering, like, do you get hatred about that from the right at all, or is it mostly from the left?
So it's an interesting one because I think there's a grain of truth to what you're saying. You know, Charles Krauthammer used to say, Republicans think Democrats are dumb. Democrats think Republicans are evil. Right. And that is true. You know, 95% of the time I've been like falsely labeled as some form of ist, racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, bigoted, whatever. Right. It's been from the liberal or a person that has responded to my ideas by with character assassination in ways that I think are almost always unfair. There are some people who are genuinely racist or genuinely sexist, but it's become like candy on Halloween that they throw around these labels, and it is meaningless. But I will say I've gotten a lot of hate from the right over the years, mostly from the alt-right, mostly from the kind of Pepe Twitter, Nick Fuentes crowd, but also from the MAGA crowd over the years. When I've criticized Trump, I've gotten dunked on. From the nationalist crowd that really hates libertarians. So I guess I'd say that like I've gotten a lot of hate from both sides, definitely more from the left, particularly from the LGBT community. They're not very tolerant of people in that community who aren't lockstep liberal progressives. I was actually kicked out of a gay men's soccer league because apparently my presence made there weren't actually any. I would have been fine with it if there were, but there weren't actually any transgender people on the team. But they said that my presence made hypothetical trans people who would maybe play in the future physically unsafe. And so I was pushed out of the team because I don't even have like right-wing views on trans issues. I have kind of just a middle of the road view of it. That's pretty, I think, sensible. But yeah, that's just not even acceptable. So I found that the woke left has definitely been, for me, more in your face with the criticism and attacks, but that's partly because that's who I've engaged with a lot and critiqued a lot. I do criticize Republicans, but because I'm writing about economics and because I'm writing about LGBT and social issues sometimes, and because I'm just naturally very right-wing in my political views, I spend more of my time criticizing the left than I do the right. And so I've gotten much more backlash from the left. But I've gotten it from both. And also, the internet is not real life. And so I think there's big masses on both sides that are not hateful or going to attack you for your view, but those aren't the people that populate twitter.com.
Right. Yeah. Do you think it's weird that people don't want to talk to each other? Because in my mind, I think they're worried that their opposition might say something that makes sense and make them question what they believe. That, in my mind, is the biggest reason like there's more and more polarization, because people's ideas are getting more and more simplified and taking less and less critical thinking. So if you're forced to talk to each other and realize that the guy that doesn't agree with you is a human and actually thinks and has kids and has a life and everything. It makes it harder to otherize them and turn them into some boogeyman, like whether it's a right-wing nationalist or a left-wing communist or whatever. It seems to me that's what keeps people from wanting to talk to each other. What do you think it is?
I think it's a few things. One is that with the echo chambers that have been created by social media and college campuses and everything, it's just people aren't used to having their ideas challenged because they're in a Twitter feed and a Facebook feed that's customized for them, that only shows them the people they choose, and the algorithm feeds them stuff that confirms their biases. People increasingly only consume news and commentary from one side of the perspective. So I think that's part of the problem. Is just like any skill, if you don't use it, gets rusty, and people, in terms of listening and in terms of openness, everything's funneled them away from practicing that skill, so it's significantly degraded. The other thing too is kind of real life not segregation, but sorting of people into more and more homogenous communities, right? Like red state, blue state, religious areas and mostly non-religious areas. It's just not as common to marry someone from the opposite party, to have a church that's tons of people of different races and different parties and different worldviews, and there's less of that real life cross exposure. So I would say a lot of times the people who there's also something about the technological and digital age, the facelessness of it all, that really lets people be more vitriolic. It's funny because people will write horrible things about you on the internet. But then David French, who's I don't agree with him on everything, but he's an author and columnist I like a lot. More of a conservative, social conservative, but civil libertarian and economic libertarian. He gets tons of hate from the Trump right and in the Trump and the alt-right especially. It's pretty vicious stuff. But he actually hopped into a Clubhouse room that they were having about him. And once he was there and spoke up, all of the slurs and epithets and nasty attacks and ad hominem decreased significantly, right? Because even just audio only, it's much harder to call somebody a rhino cuck to their face over their voice even than it is to just type that behind a screen from your anonymous profile. So I would say that one of the best things you could do, and I'm not saying this should be government mandated, but just if you actually wanted as Twitter to make your platform a better place, would be to ban anonymous accounts. Make everyone show some sort of verification and put a name and a face to their words. It probably wouldn't be the best business move, but in terms of detoxifying the discourse, it would do wonders, because that it's really that facelessness, the worst, most horrible things that are ever written to me, the people that email me and say, I hope you and your boyfriend get AIDS and die. Those people are always anonymous, and that's why that's one big downside of the digital age, even though there's been lots of good parts of all of it.
Yeah, the only time I can say that type of thing still happens in real life is driving. For some reason, if you're behind the window of a car, you can act completely different than when you pull into the parking lot and get out. I don't really understand what that's about. It was so funny. I'm a truck driver, as I'm sure you know, and I had this super long trailer, so I couldn't be all the way in the right lane to take a right turn. I had to be in the next lane over to be able to make it around. And this woman pulled in while I was looking to my left to make sure that no one was coming. So I let off the clutch and started pulling out, and I looked in my mirror and she was just right there, right next to the trailer. So I stopped, and then she just laid on the air horn. I have the air horn. She laid on her horn, and she drove up, and she made sure she had eye contact with me, and she was alone in her car wearing her mask. So, it was perfect. And then she just flipped me off and drove off. And I was like, wow, you are just the definition of a Karen. It was just perfect. Like the mask, alone in the car with the being at fault in the situation, getting angry at me and flipping me off. But it is weird. Like in vehicles, for some reason, even if you're both pulling into the same parking lot and you're going to get out of the car at the same place, you can be terrible to each other. And once you open the door, it's over, and you're in a new world. I don't really understand that one either. But
yeah, and then Twitter's just everybody's in their car all the time.
Yeah. I mean, It's funny. I've even had people who like run different shows, and they'll lambast me on Twitter, and they'll go on YouTube and make all these bad comments on my video, and then I'll say, hey, why don't you come on and we can talk about this if you want? And then they just, they stop and they disappear. They don't actually want to have to vocalize any of their opinions. And I think that's pretty telling. Because you don't have to think quickly on your feet on Twitter. You have sources you can look up, and you can straw man people more easily. Like if you're actually talking face to face, you have to be more human, and you have to make sense, and you have to think of your own thoughts while you're there. You don't have to do that on Twitter. So I think that's another reason a lot of people do that. But do you think the right is becoming more tolerable? Like we said, like they seem to be willing to talk more. Do you think that's a continuing trend? Because I did think that until this year. There's been like a lot of anti-drug legislation going around the country in a lot of Republican-run states like Idaho, South Dakota. I'm just like, man, I thought you guys were kind of over this stuff, but it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, Republicans I have just mixed feelings about, because Republican has almost become a meaningless thing. Like there are people within the Republican banner that are just polar opposite. I mean, to have Tom Cotton, a neoconservative, big government social con, and Josh Hawley was like him under the same banner as Rand Paul and Thomas Massie shows you that the word Republican is basically meaningless at this point, right? It doesn't mean anything. So I just think some Republicans are great and some are really, really bad, and honestly just like socially conservative AOCs at this point. And I would have nothing in terms of allyship there, but as a whole, I think the Republican Party from a libertarian perspective is kind of schizophrenic. In some ways they're getting better. Republicans are much more open to criminal justice reform. They're constantly growing in support for marijuana decriminalization and legalization. President Trump signed the First Step Act and all that, and obviously it was just the beginning. We need so much more. But now, Tim Scott's pushing police reform, and just 20 years ago, the tough on crime Republicans never would have done any of that. Same thing with, the neoconservative Iraq War Republicans are now the America First, bring the troops home Trump people. So I think, not that they've always followed through on it, right? But there's a lot of move in the right direction. Same thing with I think gay marriage and gay rights. Republicans are really just not. It's all moving in the right direction on stuff like that. But then on some issues, they're getting worse. They're getting more hostile to immigrants and immigration. Mm-hmm. Some corners of the right are getting more friendly to big government. So I think it's a real mixed bag with Republicans. There are some trends that I find heartening. There's some that I find pretty alarming. But what I will say is the future of the Republican Party is totally up in the air right now. It's a jump ball. Who is going to, and we won't know what the next phase of the Republican Party is until the 2024 nominee is selected. Because if it is, Tucker Carlson, that is a totally different thing from if it's Rand Paul, or even if it's from Nikki Haley, or if it's Ron DeSantis. These people all have different worldviews and have different places in the spectrum. And so what direction the party goes post-Trump is still totally up in the air. And I think that until we know that, it's hard to draw too many conclusions about the party as a whole. And so until that happens, I'm kind of holding out, and I'll just take the good, take the bad. But yeah, I think until the 2024 nominee's picked and we know what the next wave of the party is going to be, it's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I've kind of given up on the Republican Party because, that's what I grew up under. And then that's what I was really hoping for a shift with under Rand Paul when he ran in 2016. And then I was kind of hoping that Trump would at least push things in the right direction where he sounded good, even if he wasn't doing much on it. But like anything good about the rhetoric of Trump that was supposed to change the hearts of Republicans, I don't really know that it has, because they were like you were saying, we tend to think that they want to bring the troops home. But then when something happens like the Soleimani airstrike, you see all of them just go nuts like it's 2003 again, and that they want to invade Iran right away. It's
it depends who we're
come on, guys.
Because I agree with you that the political class, most elected Republicans, haven't truly shifted on that. But the base has. I mean, in terms of the Republican primary electorate, 10, 15 years ago, these were the people who National Review magazine would put on the cover that any Republican who didn't support the Iraq War was a traitor and should be cast out. Right. And now it's a mainstream view to be anti-war, anti-intervention in the Republican Party. At least half the voters, I think, really are that way. So I think there's been a shift. It's not nearly as complete as I'd like it to be, but I do think it's an encouraging trend. I mean, think about just the words that Trump would use in his speeches, and he didn't follow through enough on any of this, to be clear. But he would say, great nations don't fight endless wars and do nation building. And he'd get round of applause or cheers at rallies. And it's like, imagine that compared to Bush. It is a notable paradigm shift, in my view.
Yeah, I agree to a point, but at the same time, it almost slows down progress because people think things are changing at an exponential rate, where even though he didn't start any new wars, he almost doubled the military budget that Obama had. We continued all of the wars. We ramped up the genocide in Yemen. So all these things were still going full throttle, but so many voters thought things were being reined in and, throttled. So I actually wanted Biden to win, even though I slightly would prefer Trump to Biden, just because he's so bad and he's so obviously not an ally and he's so obviously not anti-establishment that all these people who really opposed Obama and the power grabs that he was doing and the wars that he was continuing, now that Trump's gone, they don't have this false sense of security that somebody's doing what they want them to do. So now that we have Biden back, it seems like we've had a reawakening of the anti-establishment right that was pretty much asleep under Trump. I mean, you'd be shaking them like, come on, look at what's going on in Yemen right now. Look at, he just reauthorized the Patriot Act again, and all this stuff. And they were just asleep. And now suddenly the deficit matters again, and we got to get out of the Middle East and all this stuff. It's like, hey, thank you, you're back.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. I'm a little bit cynical about it, but my whole thing, my main focus these days is on free market economics and fiscal conservatism and basically, arguing against the massive blowout spending and crazy government power grab over the economy we've been seeing the last year. And unfortunately, I knew this was going to happen, but when Biden took over, there was a lot more demand and support for my commentary and my views. And I'm like, I've been saying the whole damn thing, the same damn thing the last 4 years. You can Google my name and find probably 8 or 10 articles I wrote about the debt and the deficit during Trump. But the difference is that nobody was reading them as much. And now they are. And now it's easier to get booked on Fox News to talk about it or whatever. And I guess I'll say it's better late than never. It's better some attention than none. But yeah, it is obviously true that Republicans and the conservative media and everyone, they do become all of a sudden rediscover some of these principles and ideas when a Democrat is in power. But the flip side is, well, you might say, oh, well, that's just too bad because they aren't really going to do anything about it. That's sort of true, but I will say, the Tea Party started as a reactionary anti-Obama in this same wave, but it left us with people like Rand Paul and Justin Amash and Thomas Massie in office, and they stayed there and pushed policy for many years to come. So what I'm hoping is, even if the renewed emphasis on a lot of these things is temporary in terms of the media and the base over the next few years, I am hoping we'll get a crop of elected officials or thought leaders that will come to the forefront during the wave, but then they'll stay around afterwards, because that is, I think, a form of incremental progress.
So what do you think about the Libertarian Party? I didn't join it until last year because I thought it was a joke, and that was kind of reaffirmed in 2020 that it was a joke. But it seems like a joke that I can actually hijack and I can actually make a difference in and maybe turn it into something. Where the Republican Party, I mean, there are a couple good Republicans, but for the most part, it's just such an insurmountable task to try to change the Republican Party. Do you think going for the Libertarian Party is a waste of time, or do you think it might eventually bear some fruit? What are your general thoughts there?
I guess I have mixed views. It depends what conversation and what goal we're talking about. If a libertarian leaning friend came to me and said he wanted to run for office, I would tell him you should run as a Republican. Because the truth is, and I mean, look at Young Americans for Liberty, right? Setting aside some of the controversy they've had, which is important, but that's not the point of this conversation. They've had dozens and dozens and dozens of state lawmakers elected who are very libertarian leaning, right? Many of them aren't purists, but they're all going to take us in a libertarian direction. Almost all of them, not all, but almost all of them have been elected through the GOP. So the thing about the Republican Party is a libertarian leaning person can still get elected through the GOP. If your goal is to make the GOP into a libertarian institution or save the party, I'd say, oh my God, give up and go home.
Right.
Yeah, fat chance. But if your goal is, at the moment, the best vehicle for a libertarian to get elected in practice is still through the GOP. I think the Libertarian Party could become that over time, but it's got a lot of work to do. And I'm not impressed with the candidates they've picked, the people that run it, the decisions they make, the messaging they use. And so I would love to see the Libertarian Party really succeed and become a super viable mainstream alternative, but it doesn't really fill me with promise or excitement the way things have been going. I thought Jo Jorgensen seemed like a nice person, but I thought she was a really weak candidate. No real qualifications of any kind, not particularly charismatic or well-versed in policy. And her campaign was honestly an abysmal failure, especially when you look at how Gary, who wasn't perfect, trust me, he was far cry from my ideal, he did a lot better. And he at least had mainstream credentials and got more media attention and had been a governor. And so her candidacy seemed like a step backwards more than anything else. I do think if somebody like Justin Amash was on the top of the ticket, he could unify the different factions, I think, or I at least hope, of the LP, and he would be somebody with real qualifications and chops. And I think he could be a success. But I also agree with the fact that he could maybe make a dent. Maybe he could get on the debate stage or make 10% or whatever. But ultimately, you need a 50-year plan that starts at the state and local level to build a party and build a bench. And that's the work that needs to happen. And I know a little bit of it is happening, but I just generally don't find myself particularly impressed with the party and its operations.
So do you think that they're just goofy, or they're too extreme, or they're just they're awkward, they just don't know how to talk to people? What do you view as their main problem?
Yeah, my buddy Brian Nichols talks about this a lot, but if you it feels like they go around as very kind of, by and large, quirky, eccentric, full libertarians, very far to one ideological extreme, and that's fine, but then they go and try to sell themselves as that. What they really need to do is go find the problems actual people care about and explain why libertarian solutions help them,
Right.
But not talk so much about the state and all the buzzwords and the ideology, and just say, hey, your rent is way too damn high. Did you know the reason for that is rent control? Right. And I want to roll that back if I'm elected to the city council, and that your rent within 10 years will be 20% lower. Look at this study of what happened in Denmark, or whatever. Whatever the issue might be. I'm running on, if I was to run, and I might run one day for something, I'd pick like 4 issues to run a campaign focused on. And I'd have them be the libertarian issues where the view is not fringe, right? It would be legalize marijuana, cut the income tax in half in my state, or whatever. I mean, abolishing it fully depend how realistic that is. And I'd love to see it. But you know what? Something like that. A meaningful tax reduction that everyone would benefit from. And then school choice for everyone, right? And then maybe criminal justice reform. And then I would go and find those 4 issues where the libertarian view is very popular and very mainstream. And I would go to all the affected groups. You know, Rand Paul does this. He has been to all Black churches in Kentucky and throughout the country and met with the NAACP to talk about criminal justice reform. And not many Republicans do that. Now, some libertarians might do things like that, but just in general, the approach needs to be go to the problems that people care about and offer solutions. Don't try to convince the world to be libertarians now.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Even if you want to bring in something abstract like the Federal Reserve, which is a real problem, you have to tie it to issues that people already notice. So like inflation or something, you have to say
95% of people don't even know what the Fed is.
Right.
So if you go around campaigning for end the Fed, they're going to think that you're talking about the FBI or something. Like right. You need to go and say, food prices are skyrocketing. Let me explain why and what I could do about it if you elected me. Right. And then you could explain what the Fed is. Right. But like, it seems like they have the opposite approach. And honestly, a lot of the LP's operations seem very self-indulgent. It's the kind of the only place where, and maybe this is something that plagues even libertarian nonprofits, but there's not like a profit motive, or there's not like if you run a campaign that gets 1% of the vote, all the people behind that campaign should never work again in the party. I mean, they failed, right? Like, bring in some new chops. Maybe there's a few people in there that can stick around, but like, whereas it seems like the same old folks running the show failing. I mean, how many years was Nick Sarwark the freaking chairman? And he just kept failing upward. I mean, it seems like there's an ingrained culture there that's really problematic, because you've got to have a meritocracy. You've got to have people promoted who do well and scrapped who don't do well. And that's hard to do in any non-business, but it can be done better than has been in the LP. But all of this is just kind of my view. I'm not really attached. That's not my project. Like I said, I don't really care about party politics. I care about policy ideas, and I'll work with any vehicle, whether it's the LP or the Republican Party or a Democrat on a given issue, to advance the ideas that I think are best for the American people.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think I think the reason that we need to be involved, like, because there are a lot of people who are anarchists who just don't want to do anything. They think like voting is violence. I mean, okay, I can understand that argument, but at the same time, like, you are never going to catch anybody's attention with any of these issues unless you are actively like running for office and doing things in the public eye. If you're just practicing agorism and living out in the woods, living off the grid, like, that's great, but you're never going to change people's minds. And if you don't involve yourself with this stuff, it's eventually going to involve itself with you, like we're seeing now. I mean, things are so intrusive. Things are spiraling out of control. So people have to get involved somehow. And I think the Libertarian Party, if it has the right messaging, which I agree with you, it has not. If it has people who are serious about trying to push back against some of this stuff, it might be able to reach people that the Republican Party wouldn't. Because you were kind of talking to this earlier. This wasn't exactly what you were saying, but you said that, it's weird that Thomas Massie and Rand Paul are in the same party as Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton. And I agree with that. I mean, it was weird to me. Like, I saw a lot of people who supported Rand, like I did in 2016, and then also supported Tulsi in 2020. And even though they had some major policy disagreements, it was the anti-establishment, anti-oppressive state, anti-war, anti-coercion in a lot of cases, pro-freedom people that realized, hey, these two people really want to dismantle all this horrible stuff that's going on, where Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, we're supposed to think they're polar opposites, but they're not. It seems to me like the Libertarian Party, if it brands itself correctly, it can just be an anti-state or anti-statist party that can bring people in from the right and left, as long as the people from the left don't want they don't want big government or whatever. If they're culturally left, they can come in as long as they don't want the state coercing other people. It doesn't seem like either the Democrats or Republicans are going to be able to bring people in from both sides. They seem kind of stuck on that right-left dichotomy, where I think to make any serious change, we've kind of got to put the right and left aside and just realize like state versus people, because that's really the struggle that's taking place.
Well, I actually think that libertarianism is a right-wing ideology if you use the horizontal axis as markets versus government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like full socialism or communism on one extreme, and then full free market anarcho-capitalism on the other extreme, the rightward extreme. Then I think libertarianism, which isn't the same as anarcho-capitalism, would be pretty far to the right. But that's unfortunately, that was kind of the old scale in many ways.
That's what I'm saying. Like the new right and new left is completely disconnected.
The right is not the most fiscally conservative people. It's the most far right, nationalist, populist people. So I don't even know that left and right are useful thinking as much anymore in the same way, because they just don't even make sense. You almost have to have a four axes on your graph, and the left right thing, I don't know. I do think you can identify subsets of the movements. So for example, the progressive left, the social justice left, that is, I think, a specific group of people with specific enough beliefs. The nationalist right, the socially conservative right, the libertarian wing of the GOP, right? These are identifiable factions. But if you just say left and right, or the left this, the right this, there's not actually consensus. There's not actually, like, one thing that bothers me, and I'm sure you can find examples where I've done this, right? And it is human habit, but oftentimes people will say things like Democrats believe X, and in some cases that is genuinely true. Most Democrats believe that we should have Obamacare in place or other things.
Right.
But they'll often say things like, conservative radio hosts will say like, the left this, the left, the left, the left. And I'm like, who's the left though?
Right.
Because like probably half of actual Democrat voters don't support this thing you're talking about. AOC might support it, but I don't think Joe Manchin does. Or they'll say like Democrats support X, and we'll be like, well, some do. I'd rather have you say the names of the ones that are pushing it. Say Nancy Pelosi supports X, but don't just make everything a red versus blue all the time. I mean, it's just exhausting, and it's more, I think it confuses more than it actually informs. So the left-right thing, I've really grown tired with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's kind of meaningless, and that's not the only thing that's become meaningless. Kind of all words nowadays don't mean anything anymore, and I sometimes wonder if that's intentional to keep us from getting anything accomplished. But
Orwellian, right? I mean, when they are constantly changing the meaning of words.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. Well, we're coming up on an hour here, so I'll just ask my last question, which is sort of a joke, but you're pretty libertarian on everything, and then you just become a full-blown fascist when it comes to tanks. So what's that all about?
So it's kind of a meme at this point, but basically how this conversation started was when Jo Jorgensen said on Twitter she thinks private citizens should be allowed to own tanks. I think it's kind of an absurd thing for a Libertarian Party presidential candidate to say, because one, we could debate the position itself, which we can, and I'm happy to, but just politically, it's so far outside the Overton window. If you just walk down random people on the street and stop 100 of them and say, hey, do you think private citizens should be able to own tanks with intact artillery systems? 99 are going to say, did you leave your handler around somewhere? Like it's just very far outside of the mainstream view. The thing we need to talk about is why banning assault weapons won't make Americans safer. Why concealed carry should be expanded, not limited. But it's just sometimes we get detached from the actual politics. And I think that the tanks thing is something where libertarians they don't realize how fringe they sound when they talk about things like that. And then also, like, I would just say, no one or very few people actually truly believe the Second Amendment is completely unlimited. For example, private nuke ownership should not be a thing, in my view, and I think in most people's view. So it's a question of where you draw the line. And I support a robust right to self-defense, but in the DC versus Heller case, where they really fleshed out the history of the Second Amendment, the idea was that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to self-defense, including even dangerous weapons that are in common use, right? But that's basically the language of the court case, and I don't think nukes fall into that. And I also don't think that tanks with armed artillery systems do either. I'm not sure the scenario in which one would need that for self-defense unless your neighbor has a tank and you're going to have a tank war. Also, it's just kind of funny to say ban tanks and just watch the triggered gifs of the libertarians.
Oh yeah, I mean that. Whoa, we got a weird echo here. Hold on. There we go. That's gone. Sorry about that. Yeah, I definitely just poke fun at you. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed I've been one of the top guys going after you about tanks and nukes the other day. But yeah, Brad, thanks for coming on. I'm actually about to go on your show, which I have linked in the description. I've got your Twitter page and your YouTube channel, so people can go check you out there. But just give us any other plugs you want, where people can follow you and keep up with what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the show Breaking Boundaries on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, but then on YouTube, go subscribe down below, and also turn on the bell because they don't actually show my videos to subscribers. YouTube, the algorithm is terrible. But I will have an episode with Reed coming out, I think, this upcoming week or next weekend. And we got a lot to talk about. So I'm looking forward to it. And hopefully some of your followers will come along and check out the show for you, and then stay after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll do this again sometime. I like talking to you. I like the way you think. I like the idea that you push ideas, not parties or people, especially the people thing. That's something that I've tried to get through to others, that
I've
if you
changed on that. At first I did a lot of attacking people, saying AOC is an idiotic socialist. Now I still think that, but I don't say it because I don't think it's the right way to advance your ideas. I say AOC's idea to cancel rent is idiotic, and here's why.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important difference that we all could use more of in our politics.
Well, there's even that old saying that great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. So there's a reason everybody likes to talk about people, because we all have pretty small minds in America these days. But yeah, everyone go check out his YouTube channel, check out his podcast, follow him on Twitter. Brad, thank you.